Thank you. It is a real pleasure to join you today to share my research into how the food system is set to change in the 2020s and beyond. Start off with a hint, which is that many of the foods we not only love but depend upon are fast becoming endangered species. The list includes all shellfish, most all other fish, wheat, rice, and corn, which account for 60% of the calories we consume globally from plants, tomatoes, avocados, chickens, cows, sheep, and pigs, and to add insult to injury, sugar, coffee, chocolate, and wine grapes. It turns out they're all highly vulnerable to the changes in climate we've experienced so far, ranging from extreme temperatures to droughts to fires to acidification of the oceans. This makes them the victims of this crisis. However, at the same time, they're also increasingly cast as the villains, given that the industrial agricultural practices that surround them are exacerbating changes in climate in a vicious cycle. And this is placing even greater pressure on their already fragile populations. I found this to be a shocking realization when considering the essential nature of food. If food is endangered, everything is endangered. And I wondered what this meant for our lives and really all of life going forward. It's this question that led me to found Disruption Dinner, which provides culinary adventures through our changing food system. Since then, through many dinners and continued research, I've come to see that this actually isn't all about climate, but rather about multiple forms of disruptive change, whether in our social and environmental conditions or our informational and technological capabilities, and how they are coming together as a combined push and pull force to move us away from the long-standing but now unsustainable industrial food system while moving us towards a new modern food system, and more broadly, sending the greater economy in the same direction. Now, while this direction of travel is clear, what is unclear is where exactly we'll end up from here. In that regard, I see three possible scenarios already playing out around the world. The first is a doomsday scenario in which we continue to rely on the industrial food system and experience the collapse of nature. The second is a synthetic scenario in which we harness modern capabilities to take increasing control of nature. And the third is one in which we're also harnessing modern capabilities, but to work in collaboration with nature, bringing about a more regenerative existence. In the time we have today, I'd like to explore all three scenarios with you. I'll start by making a case for why the industrial food system is driving us towards doomsday. I'll then turn to the modern food system to describe how it's both synthetic and regenerative in nature. And then lastly, I'll provide thoughts on how we can all take part in shaping the outcome from here. So with that, let's get going. The industrial food system is driving us towards doomsday. Now, this system first came about over 100 years ago in the 1920s under a very different set of conditions and capabilities. Back then, we were just 2 billion people living in rural towns and villages with low levels of development, facing wartime shortages. Then the environment consisted of extensive ecosystems which produced more resources every year than we could consume. And this kept natural systems, like our climate, in balance. In terms of capabilities, combustion engine marked the forefront of technological progress, and it was only just enabling us to unleash stores of energy concentrated in fossil fuels, to advance beyond muscle might, and rapidly disseminate information. It's this context that enabled the formation of the industrial food system around a global, linear, resource-heavy, machine-operated, and profit-maximizing value chain. Today, however, we've moved on. We're now 8 billion people living primarily in urban areas with high but highly unequal levels of development, facing rising rates of disease and geopolitical conflict. Our environment now consists of degraded and disconnected ecosystems, which produce far less every year than we consume, which is destabilizing our natural systems like the climate. Capabilities. include computing and electronics, which have catalyzed an array of related developments in other areas such as solar, wind, storage, genomics, 3D printing, data storage, AI, blockchain. This entire suite of modern capabilities is now enabling us to take precision control at the level of electrons and photons, cells and molecules, bits, bytes, and qubits. In this context, today's context, the industrial food system no longer makes sense. Yet we're continuing to rely on it to our own detriment. It's driving the global health crisis by leaving up to half the global population malnourished. Now, this is in part due to the unequal distribution of food. A third goes to waste, while 850 million people and rising do not have enough. But it's also due to lacking nutrients. We've stripped them out of the soil. 2 billion people have micronutrient deficiencies. And we're also producing ultra-processed foods, which contribute to the 2 billion obesity cases around the world. Lastly, industrial foods are laced with toxic compounds, whether pesticides, insecticides, hormones, or antibiotics. Aside from the health crisis, as we saw before, the industrial food system also plays a large part in the global climate crisis by contributing up to a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions every year. Now, we often associate this with food miles, plastic packaging, overall consumer experience, but that accounts for under 20% of the total of 25%. 80%, where the true source of emissions lies, is in how we raise animals and grow crops. Now, why this matters today more than ever is that we are dangerously close to the infamous 2-degree tipping point. You'll see in this graph an exponential rise in carbon emissions in gray and a more gradual rise in temperatures to 1.2 degrees Celsius today. The reason for this goes back to 2 degrees. Below this line, certain buffers like the ocean have kept temperatures down by absorbing excess heat and carbon. But above this line, accelerating factors like the melting of the permafrost, the dieback of the Amazon, are likely to send temperatures exponentially higher to 4, 5, maybe even 6 degrees, all within our lifetimes. To give you a visual of what our world might look like in this state, here's a map from New Scientist magazine based on geological records, NASA data, and what we know so far. Now, it's a lot to take in, but simply stated, the areas in green, where about 1 billion people live, remain habitable, whereas the areas in yellow, where about 7 billion people live, become increasingly uninhabitable. In other words, this scenario takes us to doomsday. And what might we be eating in a doomsday world? Well, we'd be lucky to end up with jellyfish, which are taking over warmer, more acidic ocean waters. Or instead of burgers, we may find ourselves turning to black beans, which grow under a range of conditions. Instead of chocolate, we may have to eat carob grown on desert-dwelling trees. It's similar, but not quite the same. So what if we instead wish to unlock one of these other two paths? How might we go about that? Well, that brings me to the second section on the modern food system. The modern food system, unlike the industrial system, is aligned with the conditions and capabilities of the 2020s. And while it's still in its nascent stage, it's already coming together around a local, circular, resource-light, autonomous value chain capable of optimizing for multiple metrics and not just one. As such, it has the potential to be both carbon negative and biodiversity positive. To see how, let's take a look behind door number 2, our synthetic worlds. Here you will find innovators all over the world harnessing the modern capabilities shown here, ranging from genomics to 3D bioprinting to bioreactors to LED, to produce foods with precision, anytime, anywhere. The list of synthetic foods includes vertically grown veg, stem cell-based fish, and of course, plant-based burgers. Walk you through the example of Beyond Meat. This is a company that set out in 2009 with a mission to decode the molecular properties of meat using big data software. Beyond, with its software, identified all of these molecules shown here and more, such as hemoglobin, which is a protein providing that attractive red color and satisfying umami taste. It then used the same big data software to identify comparable molecules from the plant kingdom, such as all of those shown here. With this alternative recipe in hand, Beyond then works with specialty suppliers to isolate out the exact molecules required. It mixes them together before running the mixture through a software-controlled extruder to precisely replicate the texture. It then packages up the end product to be sold mainly into food service before ending up consumed globally around the world. Now, I'm not sure if you've tried Beyond or other plant-based burgers, but it's important to keep in mind that this is just version 1.0 based on using plant molecules. Others are building on this approach, for example, in one area known as precision fermentation technology. Here, innovators are harnessing CRISPR-Cas9 to genetically modify yeast and bacteria cells to produce proteins once found in animals. Impossible Foods uses this technique, for example, to produce the heme protein we saw before, and this heme is what gives its burgers international acclaim for bleeding. Building on this approach even further are the innovators that are taking animal stem cells, growing them out and differentiating them to produce cells and molecules. Eat Just and Upside Foods are two examples. Now, it's important to note that advances in molecular mimicry and production aren't just about animal foods, but also apply to a range of other types of food. These developments are also converging with advances in 3D bioprinting. It's possible to take the molecules produced, load them like ink into 3D bioprinters, and precisely replicate prize cuts of meat and other foods. That was a whirlwind tour through the synthetic world and the example of modern meats, but it's not the only path. I'd like to now turn to the regenerative scenario. Here you will also find innovators all over the world harnessing the capabilities shown here, blockchain, carbon sensors, robotics, satellites, drones, to produce nutrient-rich foods along with ecosystem services. The list includes kelp noodle pasta, beef, chocolate, all of which are carbon negative and biodiversity positive. How so? Well, the regenerative approach is based on an ancient philosophy whereby organisms are not just commodity goods, but rather provide valuable services throughout their lives. Or in the case of a cow, are more than just pieces of meat. In this instance, cows provide valuable services, including grazing, which promotes CO2 absorption and healthy plant growth. They also provide natural fertilizer, which eliminates the need for chemical fertilizers, which have skyrocketed in price over the last year and are also a major source of carbon emissions. As they stomp, they also put carbon and water back into the ground. At the end of their lives, this is how they become carbon negative, biodiversity positive, foods, medicines, and materials. Now, regenerative is, again, an ancient philosophy, but what makes it different today is how it intertwines with modern capabilities to become increasingly profitable. One example is the advent of digital platforms, which is enabling consumers to connect directly with farms to source healthy local foods. Another area is the combination of soil sensors, drones, satellites, big data software, which enable farms to provide verified carbon offsets to companies with commitments to net zero. Similarly, this also enables verification for governments and organizations seeking to pay for ecosystem services. The UK is one example of a government that has moved its subsidy scheme away from commodity crops towards these services. And lastly, advances in precision agriculture are enabling the input costs to come down rapidly. All in all, synthetic and regenerative appear to be competing approaches, and indeed they are in many ways, but they are also complementary. To go through the list, synthetic tends to be big food and ag companies, whereas regenerative tends to be small local producers. It's worth noting, however, that these small local producers still produce around 70% of the global food supply. Synthetic is more geared towards addictive processed foods, which are typically found in fast food restaurants, whereas regenerative is about nourishing whole foods. Synthetic increasingly separates us from nature, whereas regenerative reconnects us with nature. Synthetic frees up land and ocean once used for industrial agriculture, while regenerative gives us the opportunity to revitalize those spaces. Lastly, synthetic provides food security in a time of increasing climate and geopolitical risk, whereas regenerative offers nature security at a time of climate risk and biodiversity loss. The modern food system has tremendous potential, but that all depends on the actions we take today and the way we shape this system. This brings us to our final section on how we can take part. In this regard, I would welcome you to use a systems framework such as the one we've explored today of disruptive changes in conditions and capabilities, moving us from an industrial to modern system. Only with this broad perspective do we see how numerous developments are interrelated and pushing us in a direction. Similarly, understanding both value chains, how they're different, how they're the same, and whether companies are part of the old industrial way or the new modern way is helpful in making an assessment. It's not to say that industrial companies are bad and modern ones are good, but rather that industrial players face growing risk and shrinking opportunities as disruptive changes are headwinds to their business models. That includes many of the key food companies shown here. Likewise, on modern businesses, they face growing opportunities and shrinking risks, such as in all of the areas outlined here. Coming back to our three scenarios, I have personally key questions for each that I would love to invite people in the room to think about, to take part in if you're not already. When it comes to the doomsday scenario, I wonder how we can manage the just decline of the industrial food system. In terms of developments in synthetic, I wonder how we can design these foods for nourishment and not disease. And lastly, with our regenerative world, how can we capture data and structure financing to truly scale this model? I'll end with one final question, which is, in this profound moment of transformation, what role do you aspire to play? Thank you so much for your time today. I encourage you all to get in touch with your questions and comments. You'll see both my email address and links to my two websites here. Thank you again, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the conference.